where these things become not scholastic is in the personal.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the things are the most real, and that's not a denial of whatever you want to call them, Platonic forms or abstractions or generic categories of whatever they would be, angels, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
powers and principalities and thrones and dominions. I'm not denying.
Whoa. All right, Luke, what are we doing?
Yeah. So here we are. This is
The eyes of the world are upon us.
the so the origin of the inspiration. You're the meaning in my life.
You're the inspiration.
For this was I think you reached out to me after watching Peugeot on
No,
Telos
no.
Bound.
Yeah.
Huh? Right?
Yeah.
When they were talking about non-duality and things you can't talk about.
Stuff is definitely the kind of stuff you shouldn't talk about.
And it's funny, so I and then and then that was the start of it. We started going back and forth, messaging privately, talking about it. You were talking about Job and um and I was having lots of thoughts about it, which we can recap some of them in here. And then Boyce and Jordan Hall did a discussion yesterday where they touch on a number of things that I think are related. Um, what is particularly coming to mind is the distinction that Jordan made between Jordan Hall, between transcendent truth and paradigmatic truth.
What ended up happening is this thing that I call transcendent mind. Is you begin to notice there's a whole set of human faculties that are not strictly bound to culture, that are perfectly functional and are not, can't be derivative of culture by their very nature. Intuition would be a simple example. Then enables a way of navigating reality, which is different than what I would call paradigmatic mind. And paradigmatic mind is the toolkit that is ultimately bound to a given cultural construct, is produced by it and reproduces it. And historically, what we've done is we have rested on top of transcendent mind, optimized using paradigmatic mind. When we needed to transition from one niche to another, some of us would move back into transcendent mind, and then enable the transition of the paradigm to a new paradigm. We went from one niche to another niche.
I think that ties in here. But there is, I guess, the big picture thing that I want to talk about and that I would probably add and push further up and further in and perhaps differ from Peugeot on, and I've talked to you a little bit about this, is that, but maybe this can be a stepping off point, is I kind of disagree with Peugeot that these are things that you cannot talk about and that you should not talk about.
Well,
I think,
yeah. Let
yeah,
me try to summarize what I think Peugeot said.
okay,
Because
yeah,
the
Okay, so
guy on that video.
stuff is definitely the kind of stuff you shouldn't talk about because this is the problem. So a good way.
Sorry, John.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. So it has to do with the problem of secret, and it has to do with the problem of what the dark potential, what its purpose is, right? And so if you think of, there's a mysterious way in which we talk about, God as being beyond being, and there are even some of the church fathers that use very strange words, like I think it's Saint Isaac the Syrian who talks about the womb of the divine. Okay, so these are very difficult notions that are difficult, and one of the reasons is because some of the aspect of God that is beyond being is the aspect of God that we should not speak of, because that's what it is. That's what it is not, right? That's the problem of things that are beyond being. And so it's very dangerous to want to talk about all that, because you are betraying its mystery in the very pronunciation of the mystery. And so this is one of the problems of the mystery of the feminine, and why, you know, everybody today wants to talk about the divine feminine. Like, everybody just wants to, it's like, let's talk about the divine feminine. Let's you know, what's the divine feminine? What is that? And the answer is shut up. Like, that's basically the answer. Is like to the extent that there is a relationship between, let's say, the lower aspect, or the tohu bohu, and the non-being of God, then you should not talk about it. It's pretty simple. I know it sounds, it's annoying, you know, because the things we talk about, they're the patterns. They come from patterns of being. Therefore, that is what we talk about when we talk about God, because that is what positive speaking is. Positive speaking and propositions and all the things that are related to pattern and light and manifestation, those are the things that make up meaning and make up language and make up the things we can encounter. And so then when we say God in heaven, because God in heaven, that's the only thing you can even talk about.
Right.
And I think that it's really important to understand, like, this is the problem of non-dualism. I always say Christianity is a non-dual religion, but it is the problem of understanding that non-dualism manifests itself in dualism, right? You do not have manifest non-dualism. In order for non-dualism to become something that you can even speak about or encounter or allude to, then you enter into dualism. And you have to respect the reality of dualism when you speak about it. And that's the problem of all the weird esoteric crap. Like, all of that stuff is, I think, is a misunderstanding of this problem, which is they're trying to make non-dualism manifest, and they're doing it in a way that is destructive to reality, because they try to get that dark stuff out, right? You know, the whole cliche, you know, about the Sabbateans, right? Like this notion that, you know, the Jacob Frank type esotericists that say, well, if God is beyond being, therefore we should also break the law, right? Because God is not bound by that. And if we want to transcend duality, then we should both follow the law and break the law.
Vajrayana.
Yeah, and that is like a vortex. That's like bringing a vortex into reality. That is literally a monster eating the world. You know, now, the truth is that the non-dual aspect of God did manifest in the world, but it looks like a king on a cross. Like, it looks like the crucifix. That's what it looks like. It looks like, in order for it to be true, it has to be a self-emptying. It has to be a kind of you know, the paradox of the crucifixion. That's the only way. And I think that the crucifixion is the only fully manifest, or, you know, eternal temporal collision that helps us understand the non-dual aspect of reality, and the non-dual aspect of God as well.
And then in Peugeot's image of everything, he's got Christ on the tree of life.
These two opposites joined together into one glory. And of course, in the center of the sun is the darkness, which is now the divine darkness, and echoes the death which you see below. And so at the bottom of the mountain, you see there's a dark space, and then there's the skull of Adam, and then at the top there's a dark space, and then in the center is the head of Christ. And so you see that there's this relationship, but this transcendence in joining both, like I said, life and death, and glory and death together in one place, which is the place of the cross.
So that's kind of like what Peugeot was saying. So I sent it to you because I was like sort of having a little bit of an existential crisis over Peugeot's refusal to talk about it and saying to shut up about it. Because I'm like, this is something I'm trying to point to that sort of is in the book of Job, and like we can't talk about it. Like, what is it? And then like, but is that part of like my problem? Like delving into that, is that actually part of the problem, or is it that there's something there that we do need to talk about, that we do need to um, explore, and just like we don't have any words for it right now, or something like that. So, but
I think it's more so that we do have words for it. We don't have consciousness that apprehends it. Yeah.
yeah, well, and this, so I think there is a problem with um, trying to describe, talk about it in terms of propositions. Like you get a better sense of it when you're talking in the poetic, or the in some other way, rather than trying to um, describe it in terms of facts or something.
So here's where I want to go with it because I actually think that that pattern, the darkness, the chaos, the unformed, mysteriousness of God, um, and Peugeot in that video talked about like the difference between what did he say, the chaos from below and the darkness above, like the tohu abohu, and then the darkness of God. And he said those things are different, but in Christ they are
Brings them
one.
together.
But you can't really say that. Like the crown of thorns is the crown of thorns, or it's like non-duality. Because he says early on in the thing is like you can't any essentially what you were just saying. If you express non-duality, it falls out of non-duality into dualism because it's the either or, because it's stated, because it's present, because it's manifest, and so it falls out of non-duality. But then instantly, I have a knee-jerk reaction to that where I'm like, no, it doesn't. This is the this is the non-dualism and the maybe the church of the contradiction, the the infinite hiddenness that is in everything that is manifest, which I call the radical implications of the incarnation. And so, like, because it's simple. I mean, it's somewhat like if you treat a person, which is a manifest expression of something, as if it's an either or rather than a both and, if you collapse it into some distinction, into a dual category, people don't like being treated that way. But nothing likes being treated that way. Everything operates that way. Like even language operates that way. And what I would say is, like even memory, the thing where I was going to say is Rogan will talk about a lot. This thing that blows his mind is like, where do ideas come from? Any idea that you have, like, where does that come from? Before it's manifest in your head, and which may be even nonverbal, but all of a sudden you get an idea. But from where'st does that idea come?
Worst.
And it's what it makes me think of is this clip that I love to talk about with Cormac McCarthy and the unconscious, and where he talks about it's from a longer interview, but when he'll talk about whenever any of us have an idea, we say, and he says, and we'll have this phenomenon where it's just like, okay, how to say that, and he's like, how to say what? Like, what is that thing, that pre-verbal thing that but you don't yet know how to put into words? Well, that's some kind of a ethereal thing that has identity, but also doesn't fully have identity because you don't know how to name it yet. And he talks about the unconscious, and he does it through evolutionary biology and how the unconscious is so much older than the conscious and articulable. Like that part of our consciousness is so much bigger and deeper and more vast in which the articulable consciousness manifests. But what I would argue is that that is still present in the articulable thing, but we forget that, which is essentially like what another way to conceptualize it is that everything that you say contains its opposite and its Tao, which is kind of like a Christologic. But I think that's even present. It's obviously present in poetry. But one of my big arguments with iconic thinking is that it's also present in prose and in propositions.
Mhm.
Because you push those far enough and they will collapse in on themselves and will get into a state of meaninglessness. If you pursue meaning in a certain way, that will collapse and you'll end up with babble. In your pursuit of meaning, you'll end up with babble. Well, that's just the chaos manifesting out of what you thought was absolute, if that makes sense.
I have a question. Is there a proper way and an improper way to approach non-duality?
Yeah, I think so. Um, I think you fundamentally have to approach it with the humility, and what the humility is that you don't understand it in an encapsulable way, because then you're not treating it as non-duality. You're treating it as if it's a binary, which is non-duality and duality, and you're treating those as if they're both like even those distinctions are absolute. But that's not the real non-duality. It's kind of like the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao.
What
The
about the
non-duality
example?
that can be named.
What about the example that Peugeot used where you have a guru eating rotten fish? Because he's like,
Yes.
all is one. And
Yeah.
Peugeot's like, that's death. Like, that's not non-duality. That's just death.
Yes, I think that's more of like the non-Christian Eastern mysticism that all is one, and so it collapses, and so it eliminates distinction, eliminates hierarchy, eliminates relation ultimately. But I think Christian non-duality maintains this mystical chaos that is behind everything while maintaining order and structure and hierarchy and relation. It's like what Jed says when he says everything is relative, but it's not arbitrary. I think the guru eating the fish says everything's arbitrary. All is one and arbitrary, but I think you can say all is one and not arbitrary.
Right, right. So, it reminds me of in Romans when Paul is, he's talking about God's grace, and he says, because where sin abounds, grace abounds too. And then he's like, well, what,
Right.
why don't I just sin then so that grace can abound more? And
Like
Paul
no, no,
doesn't
no, no, no.
Paul
Yeah.
Paul doesn't go into an argument about that. He just says, by no means. Like he kind of just goes, whoosh, and he does that several times.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he goes to great lengths in certain arguments to like logically put it out. And then in these other things that come along, he just puts a no. Like
Yeah.
like it's like a firm boundary. So there's this exploration
Yeah.
and this reasoning that he's walking people through. And then on these other things, he's like, by no means.
Hmm.
And um I get that that's a sense of like what Peugeot is doing when he's like just shut up. Like stop talking about it. Um I don't know. What's your
Yeah, I think there is a bit of that. Um, and I don't know. I don't know if this is arrogant or hubristic of me, but like I want to acknowledge that impulse and that tendency to not collapse something into meaninglessness. But 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 also I want to push beyond it and say again, I think you can affirm the oneness of everything with the distinction. It's kind of like what it makes me think of. Well, it makes me think of Till We Have Faces, and it makes me think of Job, obviously, and what it means to be truly human and entering into wisdom via a voluntary acceptance of pain and suffering. Because a little bit, like there are these little through some of my I don't know, call it what you want, therapy, psychology, self-work stuff, for lack of a better term. I've come up to like these little axioms that are something as there's a couple of them like suffering equals pain times resistance. And it's making a distinction between pain and suffering. Like pain's going to happen. Pain's inevitable. Pain's part of the world. Suffering is the resistance of that pain rather than the voluntary acceptance of it. Or another way to say it is like you choose to suffer, which is probably not something that you say to someone who is suffering. But yet at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not true. I don't think it's that you choose to live in pain. To live in pain is to be part of being, I think. Um, but I don't know that that means that you need to have suffering. And where I was trying to go with that is the distinction that we've had with some of our Jewish friends in the corner, which is a difference that at least Judaism and some parts of Christianity have between good and evil, because this is kind of a perennial debate in in the TLC. But I think if you acknowledge the kind of non-duality that we're talking about, then ultimately, like this is one of those things. I think you have to maintain a distinction between good and evil, but also realizing there's a higher unity that lies behind that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I think you have to do that. And so, like to Peugeot, I would say, does it mean you just don't talk about that? Well, I think you actually can talk about that, and I think talking about that can actually be helpful. And this is probably where I would push the conversation with my thing is what I call the radical implications of the incarnation, and that the person is the center of all meaning and all things.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could say in an abstract way somewhat, these are conversations we had a long time ago in Voxer, that you could say that God is this person behind the distinction of good and evil, and that somehow that has resolution in God. But that doesn't necessarily, I think where Job and Jesus and our own lives push us is that that distinction needs to be realized and manifest in your own being.
Yeah. Well, what it makes me think of um how Job in his um complaint against God is basically that God's being unjust. There's a miscarriage of justice. I'm innocent. If only God could hear me, he would respond to me and I would prove my case and all this stuff. And when God responds, God doesn't respond in those terms. He doesn't respond in about right and wrong.
He doesn't respond in abstractions.
Well, and God's response is basically, well, there's a few things going on. Like one is um he doesn't it, Chesterton has a great thing. I love quoting it. He says God is explicit to the point of violence that any of it can be explained. So this is it's not that there's an explanation and God's withholding it, or that we're too dumb to comprehend it. So God has to like basically say, "Hey, you're too dumb. Sorry, I can't give this to you." It's that it cannot be explained. It's not
It
explainable.
cannot be explained in, this is what I would say, is it cannot be explained in words, in language per se. It cannot be
Right.
explained in language as a transaction to understand it, what I
Right.
call a definitional understanding. You can't just give someone a bunch of words where they understand it. They have to live it.
Right. Well, you and then God basically sort of puts all of creation on display from the
Hmm.
foundations of the world to the rain to the lion to the ostrich to behemoth and leviathan, and he puts it all on display, and there's something there where um it's a tour de force of um here is the outworking of my work. these are the things that I don't want to use the word emerge, but these are the things that emerge from what I'm doing. And so the thing there's something hidden that cannot be explained, but here's the results of it. And it's all this stuff. It's the whole world. It's all of creation.
Yeah.
Okay. And then each thing has its own particularity. And I was talking with Yosef about the ostrich, because the ostrich is like cruel to her young, kind of neglectful of her eggs, not aware that a foot may crush them, but yet look at her run. She laughs at horse and rider. And so God sort of glories in this bird that's running with such great speed. Like, look at that.
But what is
But yet
that?
there's
So,
this like there's this side of her where it's a little bit confusing for us, where we're like, yeah, but look at this other side of her. And but God is just saying, like, this is how I made her. And then there's other qualities of other animals that he points out.
Mhm.
And at the very end, God says to the friends, I'm angry with you because you didn't speak rightly about me like Job did. So what I think one thing that's going on there, I think, is that Job's desire and heart for justice is like something that God has put in man. And this is something like, well, yeah, we desire justice. We work to have justice in our communities and all that. And um, that's great. But if we try to project that out and then understand the hidden things of God, it doesn't quite work. Um, the What we then have to see is that justice on a larger scale for God is how everything sort of fits together to get, um, you know,
Yeah.
maintaining their distinction, but also compromising a whole world of things
Yes.
that is so varied and unique. And God just presents, a smattering of these, and it's sort of overwhelming because you can't keep up. But what you do is you get a sense of you get a sense of awe, fear and awe. So um trying to figure out where I was going, somewhere specific, and I kind of like lost my train. But I guess
Do you want me to jump in with some of the things I was thinking?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to, I wanted to, I was stopping myself because I wanted to hear where you were going because I had thoughts while you were
Yeah,
speaking.
yeah, jump in.
Okay. But if you lost it, maybe this will help. So I think in like the illustrations that God uses, I was gonna say while you were talking about that, if you abstract what he's saying about the ostrich, I don't think that's what God does. But you could do this from what he's saying, is say like, look at this, look at these two incompatible things about the ostrich. Completely stupid. These things make no sense, dumb, and then look at this glorious side. And what he's saying, I think, by just pointing out that in the ostrich, is he's saying these two things are one. Those two seeming pole opposite things are unified in the ostrich.
Hmm.
And then I think what he's
Well, the
saying,
ostrich, I would just let me. The
yeah, yeah, yeah.
ostrich is whole in itself.
Yes.
It has a wholeness about it that you actually can't draw a distinction between the way the young are raised and the way it runs.
No,
Like it,
which is the personal
yeah, yeah.
aspect of the ostrich. The
Hmm.
ostrich is the unity of those things. And so is that non-dual or is that dual? No, that's non-dual because they're both are present in the being of the ostrich itself. And everything is that way. It's like even justice. So then you were talking about justice and Job's idea of justice. Well, I think, but this is the thing that we often talk about in the corner is that the non-dual aspect of is like mercy triumphs over justice. That's the non-dual aspect of justice, is that the seeming opposite of justice is mercy. But what we don't understand in the wisdom of God is that those two things are one in a way that is. So back to your question, is there a right and a wrong way to approach non-duality? Well, I think you can approach the non-duality of justice in two different ways. And largely, I think this is probably just dependent on your temperament, like very Jonathan Haidt types of way. You will approach that non-dual reality of justice and mercy, and you will either go this way of like justice, which will lend towards some kind of moralistic, punitive, uh, legislative mode of like punishment, justice on this side, and this is what justice is, or you go this route of absolute mercy, but neglecting the other. And the truth is, no, it's both. It's both of those in a unity that is that almost can't like that again in its fullness cannot be named and distilled or prescribed, but it's lived. And I think the last idea that I had while you were saying this is like even when it comes to poetry or prose, like think about your marriage or think about your life with your children. What does it mean to love them appropriately? And this came up, I was talking to Tunji in the Discord about this. Like the only thing you can prescribe something like love in the Bible, and it says that, love your neighbor, love your enemies, love, pray for those who persecute you. You can do all these things, but you can only prescribe that in the generic. What does it mean to actually do that? Like before I had kids or before I got married, I could read every parenting book on earth theoretically. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
throw out like some idea. I could read every book of poetry on love. Neither of those things in and of themselves, in the abstract, are going to show me what it really means to love my family. I'm learning these things every day of what it means to love my kids properly.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get there except through the pain of living that reality. You won't understand the way you're supposed to understand. This is knowing as you are known. This is the kind of knowledge that I think Paul's talking about in First Corinthians. It's through the lived reality. It's through the being. And guess what? I think in Christianity, you would say even God learns that way because of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Because this came up. So my daughter, all my kids have had to do this at their school because they go to a religious school. And my daughter came home yesterday and she was asking me, they have to answer this question, does God change? And they have to write half a page to a page. And so she asked me, my youngest is more of a perfectionist, like do this, like I want to do it right, you know. She's not wired like me where she's just like, well, I'll just write what I think. And we'll just see what happens. Um and so I told her, so my response to that was, well, because I mean I've had familiarity with this teacher now, and I'm like, and I said I know the answer that he thinks is right, and I know how he would frame that and what he would say. And but then I said, but then you ask the question like, does God change? Okay, the answer is no, divine simplicity, right? But then I think as Christians you can say, okay, well, was Jesus God? Yeah. Did Jesus change? Well, I mean, he definitely changed in some ways. And then I said, you could start going through all these philosophical hoops, which I know our good Catholic and Protestant brothers and sisters will do. And within Orthodoxy, we'll do some of this too, is like, well, divine nature is unchanging, human nature changes. But then, yeah, but like, what is the unity behind those distinctions?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. Like the
Mm-hmm.
person is the unity, the whatever hypostasis of those two distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
So like whatever, you can end up making distinctions, but then like ultimately there's a higher unity that is the person, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the manifestation that is non-duality. And so like, you can talk about all this. This is the point where I want to go with this conversation. You can talk about this stuff scholastically, which like the telos bound guys did, and
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Peugeot does. A lot of Orthodox people, despite all of their scholastic criticism of scholasticism, where these things become not scholastic is in the personal.
Mm-hmm.
that's where the things are the most real. And that's not a denial of whatever you want to call them, Platonic forms or abstractions or generic categories of whatever they would be, angels, I suppose,
Hmm.
powers and principalities and thrones and dominions. I'm not denying that stuff, but like that stuff is not, this is where I went, sorry, one more thing. This is where I went with that I don't think people were understanding me in the Discord that I was trying to say is like I think what Christianity did was collapsed the division between these abstract, not abstract, but these ethereal, airy body patterns and the physical embodied manifestation of it. Because like I made a comment on this other video that Telos Bound somebody sent to me about it ended up with like talking about relational ontology and ultimately personalism. I maybe sent you the the comments that I made because here where I want to go with this is that they said where was it? Yeah. Communal ontology, they said, entails universalism because essentially who you are, and they said who you are cannot be separated from who you love. So like essentially if you love someone who's in hell, like you just can't like, blissfully be in heaven because like somebody you love's in hell. And so that's the like harrowing of hell that Jesus did. This is something that my boy Jason Schweizer always likes to talk about. He's like, what it means to be a Christian is to wish yourself a curse for the sake of your brethren. Because that is
Mhm.
what Jesus did. He made himself a curse for the sake of his brethren. And so, like, if the ultimate standard and rule and abstraction becomes love one another and loving your enemies, which I don't know how a Christian can deny that we're called to love our enemies, how that's ultimately pushing toward universal reconciliation. And so like if you flip it, it's not that these things are like true in the abstract. It's that it's like no man left behind kind of a thing. It's like you can't just like live in these abstract patterns of like your idealism. As a Christian, you truly have to make yourself nothing and say no man left behind, even my enemies. There isn't some idea category where I can just be okay in this blissful heaven apart while my enemies suffer. No, I
Hmm.
love them. And that's like the personal nature of everything, which like I guess what I'm trying to say is like you can't scholastically invert. I think what most people do is they like it's kind of like the truth first approach where they'll say like God is this, God is that, truth is this, these are the true things, and then they hate their neighbor. I mean, the Bible talks about these kinds of categories, or their children or their spouses for the sake of their truth. Christianity inverts that. You can't do that. You're called to love your enemies. So the
Hmm.
person is the most important thing, not your abstract idea. And
Hmm.
in loving the person, you'll discover the fullness of the truth of that abstract idea. But the person comes first, not your idea of truth or love or whoever they are. They come first.
Hmm.
And I guess I don't know. Maybe that's me trying to root non-duality in an embodied life of love of everyone, up to and including your enemy. And that's kind of what Peugeot was talking about, because like non-duality only manifests, like he said, in self-emptying. That's like
Yeah.
non-duality is the king of the cosmos crucified.
Yeah.
And it's you voluntarily giving up your life either daily in a white martyrdom or in a red martyrdom of just like kill me, I guess. I'm not choosing myself over you. I'm not going to do that. That's an embodied non-duality, not abstract.
Hmm.
I was trying to weave in Job to that.
I can. Well, you know what's making me think? Like I've been going through Dante's Inferno, and now into Purgatorio. But one thing that's interesting about Inferno is that Dante says that everyone there is punished for their sin, and they love their sin more than God. So, and it's not even punishment. They're like, sin needs to be destroyed, and these people had traded their personhood for sin, and so they don't have they're not persons anymore. They had the potential of being persons, and now they're not. And then everyone in purgatory is being purified of their vices, and everyone in purgatory will be saved. It's just a matter of purification. Um, and so there's this differentiation between sin and vices. Like no one is being punished for their vices in hell or suffering for their vices, however you. But everyone needs to be purified of them because you can't go to paradise um, with these things. And so, like,
It's only
part of
persons
me
in
is,
paradise.
yeah, well, and not only that, like you become more of a person than you ever were. Like you become the fullness of a person in paradise. And then, um, yeah, and it's interesting too because all of all of Dante's comedy takes place after the resurrection. So like when they're going through hell, there's parts of hell that are like wrecked because it's like the path that Jesus took as he like barreled through there, which is
It's
which
a
is
pretty sweet
hilarious.
image.
And
Yeah.
and like and the gates are locked from the inside. No one wants out of there. Everyone's like sort of like suffering, but also like unable to like comprehend anything else.
Which is
And
so true to our experience.
right.
I mean, that's like your suffering is just something you can't see your way out of.
Mm-hmm.
Which there are private conversations that I'm having in my own personal life. Like I've been mentioning this to Chad a little bit, but I've just been seeing more and more. Like the truth in Alcoholics Anonymous of getting to that rock bottom, whatever yours is, and realizing you have no power, and then submitting to the God of your own understanding is how everything is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the people in hell are like unable to submit because they just like they went too far down that road. But then so it's after the resurrection, but it's also before the final judgment.
Mm,
So it leaves this and Dante kind of plays with this in little areas here and there where like there's it's like can someone move from hell into purgatory? And it's like no, but here's this guy who was in hell. Virgil's a good example. Virgil was in hell and he was
yeah.
called to serve Dante by Beatrice comes down and like asks him, go help him. And so he goes and Virgil ends up in purgatory after this, and everyone in purgatory is saved after the final judgment. But so there's these weird possibilities that are like still open, but yet, um, but yet there'll be other things where like everyone's going to be resurrected, including those in hell, and and then Dante asks the question is like after the resurrection, are these people in hell going to suffer more or less, or what's their fate? And Virgil says, well, after the resurrection, they'll be made more perfect. And when you're more perfect, you you have an increase in both pain and pleasure. And so you're just like, holy crap. Like they're gonna suffer worse or something. Like it kind of leaves it open. It's not even like a final statement or and you're like, who's gonna stay there and like what's the state of their personhood? Because you're saying like why would God put people in hell? And part of the answer is like there's no people in hell. There's no persons there. It's just sin. And like you can identify with your sin so much that you can be lost. And I'm like, holy crap, that's that's you know, so that's one way. That's one thing that was coming to mind, which is interesting. And then, and the opposite is true too. Like if you identify with God and deepen, your repentance and um strive after him, like there's characters in purgatory where you're like this person should be in hell, but yet we're told, like, as long as there's like, the tiniest hope or the tiniest little spark left, they end up in purgatory. Like there's, you know,
Hmm. I
and then,
think, yeah, go.
yeah, and then there's the whole, like, everyone's helping each other through purgatory, like the prayers for each other, the prayers of the living for the dead, and the prayers for well, in the liturgies they do together and all this stuff. And there's like there's almost like this communal aspect of purgatory, as they're everyone's working their way together and helping each other, and in this way where it's almost like it's not quite this explicit, but no one makes it on because of anything on their own effort. And it's not just like God does it all, I don't do anything. Like, it's not even that. It's like God through everyone else helps you, and then there's also the effort that you need to make too. And so it's like this strength, everything's working its way up towards paradise. And so, um, yeah, that,
I mean, all the multiplicity as one. I mean, but that's like I think that's again another affirmation of relational ontology and person making is that what it means to be a person and maybe work your way out of purgatory and hell is to have proper relations with everyone
yeah,
that's around you. And I guess you're in purgatory because you've given yourself up to so much sin and licentiousness that you're who you really are and your person is so diminished and squelched that you are given this again out of the duality. You're given this grace of this kind of pain to learn to grow together. But like it's not
mhm,
going to be, it's not as if you're like, this is where that I think the mode of the understanding of hell or purgatory as just like mere punitive punishment for like some sort of
yeah,
breaking of abstract rules is so horrific.
yeah.
Um,
Well, that the example with George MacDonald in the book Lilith, that's like the most beautiful example. You know what I'm talking about at the
hmm
end of Lilith, where
hmm
she's got her, atrophied, withered hand, and they're
hmm
like, you have to let go, and she's like, I can't. Like, it's just like her hand, and so it's the per, and so uh they end up she gets her hand cut off because she can't let go. But that's the perfect thing of like, was it mercy? Was it justice? Was it punitive? Was it also like a grace? Like
what was
she,
that? Yeah.
well, it was all those things at once. It's the
hmm
perfect,
Yeah.
McDonald gets it right. And so, um,
Better to lose an arm or limb than to be cast forever into hell
yeah. And so
or an
there,
eye.
and yeah, and you know, I think, you know, Paul talks about this in Romans also, because he's like, people have these arguments like, why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why is God, making it hard for these people, and, you know, having grace on these people? And Paul's just like, God's doing his work. And then, at the end of chapter 11, he breaks out in that benediction where he's like, oh, the depths and riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways.
Hmm.
You're just like, part of it
Yeah.
is like look at all this stuff. Like, it's crazy. And also, like, we have no idea what God is up to sometimes. And like,
Yeah. And I
and
think that's kind of the humility Because I was thinking we should probably start wrapping this up. But
Yeah, I
that's
gotta wrap it
which
up too.
doesn't mean that we can't have follow-ups and continue to have conversations, which would be great, obviously. But
Well, we should have a conversation about the Jordan Hall stuff because he talked that whole idea of like transcendent mind versus what was it?
paradigmatic,
Pragmatic mind.
paradigmatic.
Paradigmatic.
Yeah.
I'll just say P mind and T mind.
P mind. I kind of have P mind right now. Um, but okay, what was we were just talking about? But that's the oh, that's to your point, that's one of the greatest postures of non-duality, which I think is maybe what the points in Job you're talking about, where it's just like, who are you, oh man? Like just cutting it off, or Jonathan saying we can't talk about this. I think what I would where I will affirm that is to say you have to have the posture of humility to your point of like how unsearchable and inscrutable are his ways. You have to have the humility, which I think is what
Yeah.
essentially mysticism is to say, like, again, it's withholding the tension between multiplicity and unity. So you're saying, like, evil and good, but there's something behind that. This is what I like to say, the thing behind the thing behind the thing. I have a lot of faith in whatever that thing is, but I can't tell you about it in a propositional way. Like I can't explain it to you. This is why I love that George MacDonald quote also from Lilith. Like, I'm sorry I can't explain the thing to you.
Oh, right.
I but barely apprehend it myself, and the fact is there's nothing in you for understanding it. That's what that whole quote is about this,
Yeah.
which is why when I read that for the first time, I just like broke down into like borderline sobbing tears in a coffee shop because I was like, this is this
Right.
is everything. This
Yeah.
is everything I've been thinking and trying to say forever. And like and someone else saw it and like wrote
Mhm.
about it. And I was just like, oh thank God. Oh thank God I'm not just a total crazy person.
Yeah.
Because I had been around people for most of my life and I continue to be of people telling me the things that I say are crazy. And I'm like, they're not crazy. I don't think the things I'm saying are crazy.
Hmm.
I think they just sound crazy to you.